My mother was carrying the good serving dish, the one with the gold rim she only brought out for holidays and birthdays, when the doorbell rang on a Tuesday evening that was neither. She set it down on the counter, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to answer it the way she'd answered that door 10,000 times before, expecting a delivery, a neighbor, nothing at all. I was setting the table when I heard her open it. I heard a man's voice, low and careful, say, "Renee, I know this is going to be a shock. My name is Victor Castellan, and I have reason to believe I'm this young woman's father." I heard my mother make a sound I had never once heard her make in 27 years of being her daughter, something between a gasp and a word that never fully formed, and then I heard the crash of porcelain hitting the kitchen floor behind me. I turned around. The gold-rimmed dish, the one she'd carried to that counter not 90 seconds earlier, lay in 3 clean pieces on the tile, a serving spoon spinning slowly beside it. My mother stood frozen in the hallway between the kitchen and the front door, one hand pressed flat against her chest, staring at a man I had never seen before in my life. He was tall, silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal coat that fit him the way clothes only fit people who have never once had to think about the cost of altering them. He held a manila envelope in one hand, and he was looking past my mother, directly at me, with an expression I would spend the next several months trying to find an adequate word for. It looked, more than anything, like grief and relief arriving in the same breath, the particular look of a man who has spent a very long time bracing for a door to open on nothing and finally, impossibly, watched it open on everything instead. "Elise," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like something rehearsed 100 times in a mirror and still not fully believed until spoken out loud. "I'm sorry to come to you like this. I didn't know how else to do it that wouldn't feel like an ambush, and I understand this already does." Behind me, I heard my stepfather's chair scrape back from the dinner table. Gerald Bramwell stood up slowly, set down his fork with a precision that told me, even before he spoke, exactly how much he had already understood in the 4 seconds since that man had said my name. He walked to the doorway of the kitchen, looked at the stranger standing on his porch, and said, in a voice I had heard directed at me 100 times over the years, but never once at anyone else, flat and cold and entirely without surprise, "Took you long enough." I would learn later that Victor had not come alone that evening in the sense that mattered, that a quiet, methodical man named Roland Finch, a private investigator Victor had retained the moment he found the intercepted letter among his mother's papers, had spent 4 careful months tracing my mother's name through decades-old employment records, marriage licenses, and school district files before finally confirming an address, and that Victor had insisted, once Roland handed him the file, on making the drive himself rather than sending anyone else to do it, because he said more than once in the weeks that followed that some doors a man has to knock on with his own hand or the knock doesn't mean anything at all. I stood in the middle of that kitchen, surrounded by broken porcelain, and understood, in the space of about 10 seconds, that everyone in that house except me had been carrying a version of this moment for a very long time. I just didn't yet understand how long or how deliberately or how much it had cost the people who raised me to keep it from arriving any sooner. I remember, oddly, noticing the small things first, the way people often do when a moment is too large to take in all at once. The smell of the pot roast still cooling on the stove. The particular pattern the broken dish had scattered in across the tile, a shape I would find myself absurdly, involuntarily memorizing, as though some part of my brain understood, before the rest of me did, that I was going to need to remember every detail of this exact minute for the rest of my life. My mother's hand still pressed to her chest, trembling slightly, the way a hand trembles after finally setting down something it has been carrying for far too long. I need to take you back, because none of what happened on that porch will make sense without the 27 years that came before it, and because I have come to understand, in the time since, that almost every quiet cruelty of my childhood had a shape and a reason I simply hadn't been given the outline for yet. Gerald Bramwell married my mother when I was just over a year old. I did not know this until I was 17, sifting through a box of old documents while looking for my own birth certificate for a passport application, and finding, instead, a marriage certificate dated a full year after the date listed on my birth record. I remember staring at those 2 dates for a long time, doing the math, understanding for the first time that Gerald had not been present for my birth, that whatever version of my early infancy I had always pictured, a young married couple bringing their new baby home together, had never actually happened. I asked my mother about it once, carefully, the way you ask about things you already suspect are wounds. She told me, in a voice that closed the subject before it had properly opened, that things had been complicated, that Gerald had come into our lives a little later than most fathers, and that it had never mattered because he'd raised me all the same. I believed her, mostly because believing her was easier than sitting with the alternative, which was that something about my earliest months had been so unstable, so precarious, that an entire year had needed to pass before anyone was willing to make our little family official. Gerald was never cruel to me in ways you could point to on a form. The way I understand some children have it far worse than I ever did, and I want to be careful about that, the same way I've learned to be careful about every hard thing I say about my childhood now. He never raised a hand to me. He fed me, housed me, sat through parent-teacher conferences with an expression of dutiful boredom that never once slid into warmth. But there was a coldness in him that I felt every single day of my life under his roof, a coldness that had a very specific shape once my half-siblings arrived. Casey was born when I was 2. Nora came 3 years after that. And from the moment Casey took his first breath in that hospital room, I wasn't allowed to visit. I understood, in the wordless way children understand things long before they have language for them, that I had become something slightly separate in that house. Not unwanted, exactly. Just adjacent. Casey and Nora got new school shoes every fall. I got Casey's old ones, worn down at the heel, a size too big, stuffed with tissue paper at the toe until I grew into them. Casey and Nora's report cards went on the refrigerator. Mine went into a drawer. When Gerald taught Casey to ride a bike in the driveway, patient and encouraging in a way I had genuinely never once seen him be with me, I sat on the porch steps and watched, and told myself, the way children tell themselves things to survive, that I simply hadn't been ready to learn yet, that my turn would come. My turn never came. Gerald taught Casey to drive. He walked Nora down the aisle at her wedding rehearsal luncheon 15 years later, made a toast about watching his little girl grow up, while I sat 3 seats down the table, technically present, essentially furniture. I want to tell you I confronted him about it at some point during those years, demanded to know why, but the truth is I didn't. I had learned, very early and very thoroughly, that asking Gerald Bramwell for anything, attention, affection, an explanation, only ever seemed to make him colder, as though the asking itself confirmed some private suspicion he'd been carrying about me since before I could talk. There is a particular memory from when I was 12 that I have carried with me more clearly than almost anything else from that house. I had made the honor roll for the first time, a genuine accomplishment for a kid who had always struggled with math, and I remember running into the kitchen with the certificate still warm from the school's printer, certain, in the specific hopeful way of a child who hasn't yet learned better, that this was the thing that would finally earn me the version of Gerald I watched him be with Casey and Nora. He looked at the certificate for perhaps 3 seconds, said, "Good, that's what's expected," and went back to his newspaper. Casey brought home a participation ribbon from a swim meet that same week, having come in 4th out of 5, and Gerald took him out for ice cream to celebrate. I did not ask why. I had already, by 12, stopped expecting the question to get me anywhere but colder. My mother, for her part, loved me in the particular, muted way of someone carrying a secret so heavy it has flattened most of her other emotions along with it. She was never unkind. She simply seemed, for as long as I can remember, to be holding her breath around me, watching me with an expression I only recognized much later, once I finally understood what it was. Not distance, but guilt. The guilt of a woman who knows exactly what she is allowed to happen and has decided, for reasons she has never once had the courage to explain, that living with it quietly is easier than telling the truth. I remember, once, when I was 9, waking in the middle of the night to the sound of my mother crying quietly in the kitchen, the kind of crying people try to keep small and contained so it won't wake the rest of the house. I stood in the hallway in my socks, too young to understand what I was witnessing, and watched her sit at the table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, staring at nothing, wiping her face with the back of her hand every few seconds like she was trying to make the tears stop through sheer force of will. I asked her the next morning if she was okay. She smiled, the particular tired smile she reserved for exactly these moments, and told me she'd just been missing her own mother, who had passed away before I was born. I believed her. I believed a great many things my mother told me over the years, mostly because the alternative that she might be lying to me for reasons too large and too frightening to explain was not a thought a 9-year-old has the tools to hold on to for very long. There was a jewelry box in her bedroom that I was never allowed to open, a small lacquered case with a broken clasp that she kept on the top shelf of her closet, out of reach for most of my childhood, though I did, once, when I was 14 and home alone with a curiosity I couldn't talk myself out of, drag a chair over and take it down. Inside was almost nothing. A pair of simple pearl earrings, a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed and soft at the creases, that I didn't read closely enough at the time to understand, and a photograph, small, a Polaroid of my mother at maybe 22, standing in front of a shop window full of gleaming jewelry displays, laughing at something outside the frame, her arm linked through the arm of a tall young man I did not recognize, someone who was decidedly not Gerald Bramwell. I remember staring at that photograph for a long time, some part of me already understanding, without being able to name it yet, that I was looking at a version of my mother's life that had existed before the version I knew, and that whoever the man in that photograph was, he had mattered enough to be kept, secretly, in a locked box on a high shelf, for reasons my 14-year-old self could not yet piece together. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I never told my mother I'd looked. And I did not think about that photograph again, not consciously, for the next 13 years, until a man in a charcoal coat stood on our porch and said my name like he'd been rehearsing it in a mirror for longer than I'd been alive. I want to tell you a little about who I became in the years between that jewelry box and that porch because I think it matters and because it is, in its own strange way, the reason everything that happened afterward unfolded the way it did. I became a gemologist. It started unglamorously with a high school internship at a small estate jewelry shop 2 towns over, sorting inventory for a kind, sharp-eyed appraiser named Mrs. Okafor who noticed, within the first 2 weeks, that I had an eye for the small inconsistencies most people walked right past, a slightly off facet angle, a setting that didn't quite match the era of the stone it held. "You see what other people don't bother looking for," she told me once, watching me flag a piece that had been misclassified for years in the shop's own inventory. "That's not something I can teach you. That's just how you're built." I did not tell her, then, that I had spent my entire childhood in a house where paying close attention to small, unspoken discrepancies had been a survival skill long before it ever became a profession. Mrs. Okafor kept me on well past that first internship, through the rest of high school, and every school break during college, and she became, in her quiet, unsentimental way, one of the few adults in my life who never once made me feel like I was being measured against someone else's biological children. She used to say, whenever I apologized for asking too many questions about a piece, that a good appraiser never apologizes for looking closely, because looking closely is the entire job, and I remember how strange and unfamiliar that sentence felt the first several times I heard it, coming from a house where looking closely, asking too much, wanting too much attention had always seemed to be exactly the wrong instinct to have. I put myself through a gemology certification program the way I imagine most of the people in stories like mine put themselves through things, on loans and a stubborn refusal to ask Gerald Bramwell for a single dollar I would then owe him the privilege of resenting me for. By 27, I had built a small, respected independent appraisal practice, working mostly with estate sales and insurance claims, the kind of quiet, detail-obsessed work that suited a person who had spent her whole life learning to notice exactly what didn't add up in a room full of people determined not to say so out loud. I had dinner with my mother most Tuesdays, a habit we'd fallen into after I moved out, one of the few threads between us that had never quite frayed even when so much else between us stayed carefully, deliberately unspoken. Gerald was usually there too, by then mostly silent, mostly buried in whatever was on his phone, the coldness between us long since calcified into something closer to mutual, comfortable avoidance. I had no reason to expect that particular Tuesday to be any different from the 100 Tuesdays before it. If you're new to this channel, this is the moment to hit subscribe because what happened after that dish hit the floor is the reason people keep coming back to hear the rest of this one. Took you long enough, Gerald said again, standing in the kitchen doorway, and something in his voice, some old, buried satisfaction finally allowed to surface, told me this was not the first time he had imagined saying those exact words to this exact man. You knew? I said, looking between the two of them, my mother still frozen by the door, the stranger still standing on the porch with his envelope, Gerald standing there with an expression that had finally, after 27 years, stopped bothering to hide itself. You knew this whole time. Elise, let's not do this here, my mother said, finding her voice at last, though it came out thin and shaking. Where would you like to do it, Renee? Gerald said, and the venom in his voice, aimed at my mother for the first time in my presence in as long as I could remember, was somehow more shocking to me than anything that had happened so far. 27 years, and you never once told her. You let me be the one who had to look at her every day and know. Know what? I said, my voice rising now, the broken dish still scattered at my feet, forgotten. Somebody tell me what's happening right now. Victor Castellan, still standing on the porch, still holding that manila envelope like it was the only solid thing left in the conversation, spoke quietly into the silence that followed. I think it might be easier if I explained, if everyone's willing to let me. He was not, in the end, invited fully inside that night. My mother asked him, in a voice barely above a whisper, to give us until the weekend, and something in his face, some old, practiced patience, told me this was not the first time in his life he had learned to wait for a door to open on its own timeline rather than force it. Before he left, I found my voice enough to ask him one question, the only one that felt urgent enough to say out loud on a porch full of broken porcelain and 27 years of silence. How did you find us? After all this time? He was quiet for a moment, and I watched something cross his face that looked almost like shame. My mother passed 6 years ago, he said. It's taken me this long to be able to go through her private papers without it undoing me completely. My wife, Margaret, died 8 months ago, and I think losing her finally gave me the strength to face whatever I might find in the boxes I'd been avoiding. I found a letter. I think it will explain more than I can standing on your porch at 9 o'clock at night. I only came in person because I owed your mother, and you, considerably more courage than a phone call would have shown. He left a business card on the small table by the entryway, along with the envelope, and told me, gently, that everything inside it was mine to look at whenever I was ready, that he wasn't asking for anything, only offering the truth, finally, after longer than he wished he'd had to wait to give it. I opened that envelope alone, in my car, 3 blocks from my mother's house, because I could not bear to open it under that roof with both of them watching. Inside was a photocopy of a letter, handwritten, dated 27 years earlier, addressed to Victor Castellan, in handwriting I recognized instantly, because I had spent every Tuesday of my adult life reading grocery lists and birthday cards written in that exact hand. Victor, it read. Asterisk, I don't know how to say this except plainly. I'm pregnant. I know the timing is impossible, with everything happening at the shop and your mother's plans for the Geneva expansion, but I wanted you to know before I make any decisions about what comes next. Please call me. Asterisk. Beneath the photocopy of the letter was a second document, a certified statement from a handwriting analyst confirming the letter's authenticity, and a third, a private paternity test result, dated 2 weeks earlier, run against a DNA sample I had never once knowingly provided, though I would later learn Victor's investigator had obtained it discreetly from a coffee cup at the appraisal office where I worked, a method I found, once the shock wore off, uncomfortably resourceful and, once I understood the full story behind it, entirely forgivable. The probability of paternity was listed at 99.99%. I sat in my car for a long time that night, reading that letter over and over. My mother's 22-year-old handwriting spelling out a truth she had apparently tried to tell someone once, a long time ago, before whatever happened next had buried it so completely that I had grown up my entire life without ever once suspecting it existed. The full story, when I finally sat down with Victor Castellan the following weekend, in the quiet back office of the flagship Castellan and Company store downtown, took most of an afternoon to tell. Victor was, I learned, the son of Constance Castellan, the formidable matriarch who had built Castellan and Company from a single storefront into one of the most respected fine jewelry houses on the East Coast over the course of nearly 50 years. Victor had been 27 himself when he met my mother, then a bright, ambitious 22-year-old apprentice gemologist working her first real job at the flagship store, sorting inventory much the way I would, unknowingly, sort inventory at a much smaller shop 2 decades later. She had exactly your eye, Victor told me, watching my face carefully as he said it, as though testing whether the resemblance he'd been carrying in his memory for nearly 3 decades would finally have somewhere real to land. She caught a misgraded stone in a consignment lot within her first month that 3 senior appraisers had missed. I noticed her long before I let myself admit I'd noticed her. They fell in love quickly, quietly, in the particular way people do when they're aware, even as it's happening, that the people around them will not approve. Constance Castellan did not approve. My mother came from very little, the daughter of a dockworker and a seamstress, and Constance, who had spent 50 years building the Castellan name into something synonymous with old-world prestige, made her opinion of the relationship known early and often. In the specific, surgical way wealthy mothers in these stories always seem to know exactly how to wound without ever raising their voice. She once told your mother, in front of 2 senior staff members, that a girl from the docks belonged behind the appraisal counter and nowhere near the family name, Victor said, his jaw tightening at the memory. I should have said something in that moment. I didn't. I told myself I'd handle it privately later, and that cowardice cost more than I understood at the time it could. He told me, too, about the months right before my mother disappeared from his life, how he'd noticed her growing quieter, more withdrawn, how he'd assumed, in the particular self-absorbed way of a young man consumed with his own career, that she was simply overwhelmed by the demands of the Geneva expansion he'd been traveling for. I called the apprentice desk when I got back, he said. They told me she'd resigned. No forwarding address, no explanation. I asked my mother if she knew anything, and she told me, very calmly, that young women like that eventually realize which world they actually belong in, and that I should be grateful she'd spared me the difficulty of ending it myself. He looked down at his hands, the same gesture I would later notice Gerald make in an entirely different kitchen, 2 men on opposite ends of the same old cruelty, both carrying some version of guilt they'd spent decades not quite finding the words for. I believed her. God help me, I believed her for 27 years. When my mother discovered she was pregnant, she wrote Victor that letter, the one I'd read alone in my car, and gave it, along with a second, private message asking him to meet her that evening, to Constance's personal assistant to pass along, because Victor had been traveling for the company's Geneva expansion, and my mother hadn't had a direct number to reach him. Constance intercepted it. She never gave it to me, Victor said quietly. I found out only 6 years ago, going through my mother's private safe after her death, that she'd read it, and instead of passing it along, she'd gone to see your mother herself, alone, and told her that I had no interest in a child, that I was already quietly engaged to someone more suitable, and that if she truly cared about my future, the kindest thing she could do was disappear from it entirely. She offered your mother a settlement to leave the city, find a husband willing to raise the child as his own, and never contact this family again. I sat very still, understanding, with a coldness that settled slowly through my whole body, exactly what that meant. Gerald, I said. I believe so, Victor said. I found records, in the same safe, of a payment made to a Gerald Bramwell 27 years ago, structured as a private loan that was never repaid and, as far as my mother's own notes indicate, was never expected to be. I think your mother was given money to disappear, and I think Gerald was given money to marry her and raise you as though you were his own, without ever asking too many questions about why. I thought about the marriage certificate dated a full year after my birth. I thought about Gerald's coldness, his particular flavor of resentment, the way he had always seemed to be looking at me as though waiting for something in me to eventually confirm a suspicion he'd been carrying since before I could talk. I understood, sitting in that quiet back office, that Gerald Bramwell had not simply failed to love me the way he loved his biological children. He had been paid to raise someone else's daughter and had spent 27 years unable to forgive either of us for the transaction he'd agreed to. Gerald did not deny it when I confronted him the following week in the same kitchen where the dish had shattered. He sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him, and for the first time in my entire life, he looked at me without the particular coldness I had spent 27 years mistaking for simple disinterest. "I was 24 and drowning in debt from my father's medical bills," he said. "Constance Castellan's people found me through a mutual acquaintance, offered me enough money to clear it entirely if I'd marry a pregnant woman and raise the child without ever telling her the truth. I told myself it was a kindness. To your mother, to you. I told myself for 27 years that it was a kindness." He looked down at his hands. "I don't think I ever fully believed that. I think I resented you for existing as a reminder of a decision I made for money, and I took that resentment out on a child who never once asked to be part of any of it. That's not something I expect you to forgive. I'm not sure I've forgiven myself for it either." "Did you ever think about telling me?" I asked. "At any point in 27 years?" He was quiet for a long time before he answered. "More times than you'd believe. There were nights I sat outside your bedroom door when you were maybe 10, trying to work out how to start the sentence. I never could find one that didn't sound like an excuse for how I'd treated you. So I told myself silence was kinder than a bad explanation, and I let the years make the choice easier by simply not choosing at all. I did not forgive him, not that day, and I want to be honest that I have still not fully arrived at forgiveness in the time since, though I have arrived, slowly, at something quieter and more useful than anger, a kind of clear-eyed understanding that the coldness I spent my childhood absorbing as evidence of some private flaw in me had never actually been about me at all. It had been about a transaction made before I was born, between a frightened young man and a ruthless old woman, and I had simply been the one left to live inside the resentment it produced. My mother, for her part, cried more in the week after that porch scene than I had seen her cry in the 27 years before combined. She told me, haltingly, over several long conversations, about the humiliation of Constance's visit, about being 22 and pregnant and alone and terrified, about believing, because a powerful old woman had told her so with absolute conviction, that Victor genuinely wanted nothing to do with either of us. She told me she had tried, more than once over the years, to find the courage to tell me the truth, and had lost that courage every single time, certain it would cost her the only child she had left any real closeness with. She described the visit itself in more detail than I expected, sitting at her kitchen table one evening the week after everything came apart, her voice steady in the particular way people's voices go steady when they are finally, after decades, allowing themselves to say something out loud exactly as it happened. Constance had come to the small apartment my mother shared with 2 other apprentices, unannounced, dressed, my mother said, like she'd wandered in from an entirely different century, and had sat across from her at a table not unlike the one we were sitting at now, and told her, without raising her voice even once, that Victor had already agreed to marry someone the family found suitable, that the pregnancy was an inconvenience Victor would thank her, eventually, for handling quietly, and that a settlement was waiting, along with an already arranged introduction to a young man named Gerald Bramwell, if she was willing to disappear before the wedding invitations went out. She said it the way you discuss a delivery schedule, my mother told me. Calm, reasonable, like she was doing me a favor by explaining the terms clearly instead of making me guess at them. I asked her if she believed it, the part about Victor already being engaged. She was quiet for a long moment before she answered. I wanted to believe her enough to survive the alternative, which was staying and finding out for myself that it might be true. I chose the version I thought I could bear. I did not judge her for that answer. I am not certain, even now, that I would have done any differently at 22, alone, with a woman that powerful sitting across my kitchen table. I'm not asking you to understand it, she said. I'm only asking you to know that not telling you was never about protecting a secret. It was about being too much of a coward to face what telling you would mean I'd have to admit I'd let happen. I believe her. I have chosen to believe her, because the alternative, that my mother simply preferred a comfortable lie to a difficult truth for nearly 3 decades, is a story I am not interested in carrying alongside everything else I've already had to carry. I have made my peace, slowly, with the fact that she was young and frightened and up against a woman with far more power than either of us has ever had to reckon with in our own lives. I have made considerably less peace with Constance Castellan, though she has, at least, had the decency to already be dead. I met my half-siblings on my father's side, Adrian and Sabine Castellan, 3 weeks after that first meeting in the back office, at a dinner Victor arranged carefully, almost nervously, at his home outside the city. The house itself surprised me, not for its size, though it was considerable, but for how lived in it felt. Family photographs crowding the mantel, a child's height marked in pencil on a doorframe I later learned belonged to Adrian at age 6, a home built for a family rather than simply for appearances, which was not at all what I had pictured walking in. Victor met me at the door himself, visibly nervous in a way that struck me as strange for a man who ran an international company, smoothing his jacket twice before he even said hello, and I understood, watching him, that this dinner mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with 27 years of wondering what a moment like this might feel like if it ever actually arrived. Sabine, 24 and the younger of the two, hugged me before I'd even fully stepped through the door, told me she'd cried when their father first told them the truth, and spent most of that dinner asking me questions about my work with an openness that made the whole evening feel, improbably, like something close to easy. She wanted to know everything, what a facet grade actually meant, whether I'd ever caught a fake diamond by accident at a party, what it had felt like growing up not knowing any of this existed. I found myself answering more honestly than I expected to, something about her directness, making it hard to retreat into the careful, guarded version of my own story I usually offered strangers. At one point, clearing plates after dessert, she paused beside me at the kitchen counter and said, quietly enough that it felt like it was just between the two of us, I used to ask my dad, when I was little, if I had any other siblings out there somewhere. I don't know why. I just always had this feeling something was missing from the count. She shrugged, a little embarrassed, and went back to stacking plates. I guess some part of me was right. I did not know what to say to that, so I simply put my hand briefly over hers on the counter, and she smiled at me, and neither of us needed to say anything else for the moment to land exactly where it needed to. Adrian, 29 and already deep in the company's operations, was considerably more guarded. He shook my hand, was polite in the careful, measured way of someone who has been raised to be polite regardless of what he privately feels, and said very little beyond what courtesy strictly required. At one point during dinner, when Sabine asked me directly whether I resented growing up without any of this, Adrian's eyes flicked toward me with an attention that told me he was listening far more closely to my answer than his silence let on. I don't think resentment is quite the right word, I told her, choosing my words carefully, aware that at least one person at that table was waiting to see exactly how I'd answer. I think I spent a long time confused about why I felt like I didn't fully belong anywhere, and now I at least understand the shape of the confusion. That's not nothing. It doesn't erase the years, but it's not nothing. I understood Adrian's caution even then. He had grown up believing himself the sole heir to a business his family had spent 3 generations building, and I had arrived, essentially overnight, as a stranger with a legitimate claim to a piece of that inheritance, appearing at exactly the moment his family was already reeling from his mother Margaret's death 8 months earlier and his grandmother's decades-old secret finally coming fully into the light. I did not blame him for needing time. I would have needed it too. He'll come around, Sabine told me privately, walking me to my car after that first dinner. He just needs to see that you're not here for what you can take. Once he sees that, he'll be impossible to get rid of. He's like that with everyone he actually decides to trust. She was right, though it took considerably longer than either of us expected, and the thing that finally convinced Adrian, more than any dinner or any conversation, was watching me do the one thing I had spent my entire life quietly training myself to do without ever once knowing why it mattered this much. Victor asked me, about 2 months into getting to know each other, whether I would consider consulting on the appraisal side of the business, informally at first, nothing that would obligate either of us to anything permanent. I said yes, mostly out of curiosity, and spent the following weeks working alongside the company's senior gemologists, reviewing inventory records, sitting in on authentication meetings for high-value consignments, learning the particular rhythms of a business I had unknowingly been circling my entire professional life, without ever understanding why the work always felt like coming home. It was in my 4th week there that I noticed the first inconsistency. Castellan and Company maintained an insurance arrangement for its most valuable pieces, standard practice for a house handling stones in the range they did, and part of that arrangement required periodic reappraisal of insured items to confirm their value hadn't shifted enough to warrant an adjustment. I was reviewing a reappraisal file for a signature sapphire and diamond necklace, a piece the company called the Castellan Star, when I noticed that the clarity grade listed in the most recent reappraisal did not match the clarity grade in the original certification from 11 years earlier, a discrepancy significant enough to have meaningfully changed the piece's insured value, and yet nobody, in 11 years, appeared to have flagged it. I mentioned it, carefully, to Adrian, who was overseeing that quarter's reappraisal cycle, expecting a simple administrative explanation. Instead, I watched something shift in his expression, the particular tightening of a person recalculating how much trouble a small detail might actually represent. "Who signed off on the most recent reappraisal?" I asked. "Simon," Adrian said quietly. "Simon Pierce, our CFO. If you've made it this far, this is exactly where I'd ask you to make sure you're subscribed, because the part where all of this finally came apart is the part everyone who's heard the story tells me they wanted to see coming." I did not go directly to Victor with a single discrepancy. I had learned, over years of appraisal work, that a single inconsistency is usually just a mistake, and that real fraud, when it exists, almost always leaves more than one thread to pull. I asked Adrian quietly for access to the full reappraisal history across the company's 12 most valuable signature pieces, and I spent the following 3 weeks, mostly on evenings and weekends, cross-referencing certification records against reappraisal files with the same patient, unglamorous attention I had once used to sort inventory for Mrs. Okafor as a teenager who had no idea yet what any of it was for. Adrian joined me for several of those evenings, at first, I think, out of a lingering wariness about letting a near stranger have unsupervised access to the company's most sensitive records, and later, as the pattern began to take shape, out of a dawning horror that made it difficult for him to look away. I remember the night he first saw it clearly himself, sitting across the conference table from me at nearly 11 at night, a row of open certification files spread between us, when he went very quiet and said, almost to himself, he was at my mother's funeral. He gave a reading. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry yet," he said, his jaw tight. "Show me everything you have. All of it. I want to understand exactly how long this has been happening before we say a single word to my father." The pattern, once we saw it clearly together, was almost elegant in its simplicity. Simon Pierce had, over roughly 9 years as CFO, quietly downgraded the recorded clarity and color grades on a rotating handful of the company's most valuable insured pieces during routine reappraisals, small enough shifts each time that no single change looked alarming on its own, but consistent enough, across 9 years and 12 pieces, to have meaningfully lowered their recorded insured value. He then, on a staggered schedule, reported several of those same pieces as damaged or lost during transit or exhibition, filing insurance claims based on the deliberately deflated valuations, while the actual stones, still fully intact and considerably more valuable than the paperwork claimed, were quietly replaced in inventory with high-quality synthetic or lesser natural equivalents, close enough to pass a casual glance, distinguishable only to someone willing to run the kind of detailed comparative analysis Simon had, for 9 years, correctly assumed nobody would bother running. Adrian and I spent 2 additional weeks, working almost entirely after hours to avoid drawing attention before we were ready, tracing the actual stones themselves. The real gems, based on shipping and consignment records I traced through 3 shell accounts registered to addresses that led, eventually, to a private dealer in Antwerp with a history of handling exactly this kind of quiet, undocumented resale, had likely been sold off individually over the better part of a decade, the proceeds routed through the same consignment channel Simon used for legitimate company business, making the money almost impossible to distinguish from ordinary operating revenue unless someone happened to be looking at the exact right rows in the exact right ledger. There was one discovery about 10 days into that phase of the investigation that I still think about more than any other. Buried in a consignment file from 6 years earlier, the same year Constance Castellan died, was a shipping record for a stone Simon had reported as accidentally destroyed during a cleaning process, a rare, unusually large pink diamond that had been part of Constance's personal collection before passing into company inventory upon her death. The real stone, the shipping record showed, had been sold to a private collector in Zurich 11 weeks after Constance's funeral for just under $2 million, money that appears, based on the banking records Adrian was eventually able to obtain through counsel, to have gone almost entirely toward a house Simon purchased in the Hamptons that same year, a house he had, on more than one occasion, hosted company holiday parties at, standing in his own front hallway making pleasant conversation with the very family he was quietly robbing. "How much?" Adrian asked, once we finally sat down with Victor together, in the same back office where I'd first heard the story of my own beginning, to lay out everything we'd found. Conservatively, across 12 pieces and 9 years, I said, somewhere between $11 and $14 million, once you account for both the insurance payouts on falsely deflated claims and the resale value of the original stones themselves. Victor sat very still for a long moment, and I watched him absorb the particular betrayal of discovering that a man he had trusted with the company's finances for nearly a decade, a man who had sat at his table, attended his wife's funeral, offered him careful, practiced condolences 8 months earlier, had spent that entire time quietly hollowing out the family's most treasured pieces and pocketing the difference. "Get me the full file," Victor said quietly. "Everything. I want to see it before he does." Simon Pierce did not go quietly, though he came considerably closer to it than Gerald Bramwell had, when confronted with a version of the same essential moment, a truth he'd spent years assuming would never be looked at closely enough to surface. He was called into a meeting with Victor, Adrian, and outside counsel on a Thursday morning, ostensibly to review quarterly projections, and I was present as well, at Victor's insistence, sitting quietly at the end of the table with the full comparative file in front of me. Simon walked in wearing the same easy, confident smile I'd watched him wear at every company function since Victor had first introduced us, and I remember thinking, watching him settle into his chair and reach for the coffee someone had poured him, that he had absolutely no idea this was the last ordinary morning he would ever have in that building. His composure held for almost the entire first 10 minutes, right up until Adrian slid the reappraisal history for the Castellan Star across the table and asked him, directly, to explain the clarity grade discrepancy. "There are natural variances in appraisal methodology," Simon said, his voice even, professional, the voice of a man who had clearly rehearsed some version of this explanation for longer than he'd ever expected to need it. "Different appraisers, different equipment. It happens. It happens on 12 different pieces, in the same direction, every single time, across 9 years, only ever on reappraisals you personally signed off on," I said, sliding the second file across the table, the shell company records, the shipping documentation, the Antwerp dealer's transaction history. "Natural variance doesn't produce a pattern this consistent, Mr. Pierce. Fraud does." I watched something shift behind his eyes, the particular recalculation of a man realizing, in real time, that the room he'd walked into was not the room he'd prepared for. He looked at Victor, and for just a moment, something almost pleading crossed his face. "Victor, you've known me for 11 years. Whatever this young woman thinks she's found, I promise you there's context here you're not seeing." "Show me the context, then," Victor said quietly, and I had never before heard that particular register in his voice, something colder and more final than anything I'd witnessed from him in the months I'd known him. "Explain to me why my mother's pink diamond was sold in Zurich 11 weeks after her funeral, Simon. Explain to me why the money went into a house you hosted my grandchildren's future holiday parties in." Simon did not have an explanation. He sat in silence for a long moment, and I watched, in that silence, the particular quiet I had come, in the months since that porch scene, to recognize as the exact sound of someone's carefully maintained version of themselves finishing its collapse. He resigned within the hour, before the board could be formally convened to remove him, and Victor's counsel filed a criminal referral the same week, along with a civil action to recover as much of the diverted funds as could still be traced. "I understand," From updates Adrian occasionally passes along, that Simon has since agreed to a plea arrangement that includes partial restitution and a lengthy prison sentence, the specifics of which are still being finalized as the broader investigation into the Antwerp dealer's other clients continues to unfold. The company itself absorbed the news slowly, the way any organization absorbs the discovery that someone trusted at the highest level was capable of this kind of sustained, patient betrayal. I sat in on a meeting with the finance team a week later, most of whom had reported to Simon directly for years, watching them process the particular disorientation of learning that a boss they had respected, in some cases genuinely liked, had spent nearly a decade quietly hollowing out the company from the inside while smiling at them across the break room every single morning. One junior analyst, a young woman not much younger than I'd been when I started at Mrs. Okafor's shop, asked me afterward whether she should have noticed something. "You weren't supposed to notice," I told her, meaning it. "He built this specifically so that people at your level would never have reason to question the numbers a senior officer handed you. The failure here wasn't yours. It was a structural one, and it's already being fixed." I meant that too, because within a month, Victor had authorized a complete overhaul of the reappraisal process, requiring 2 independent authentications on every signature piece going forward, a policy that exists now, quietly, permanently, because of exactly what happened to slip through for 9 years before anyone thought to double-check. Adrian looked at me differently after that meeting, and I don't think it was only gratitude, though there was plenty of that too. I think it was the particular, hard-won respect of someone who had spent months quietly waiting to see whether I was a threat to what he'd built his whole identity around, and had instead watched me spend 3 unpaid weekends protecting it. "I owe you an apology," he told me, a few days later, finding me in the appraisal office reviewing an unrelated consignment lot. "I spent months treating you like someone here to take something from this family. You spent those same months quietly saving us from someone who actually was." "You didn't owe me anything, Adrian," I said. "You just watched your whole understanding of your family's history rearrange itself overnight." I'd have been suspicious of me too. Sabine wasn't. Sabine didn't grow up carrying the weight of being the one who was supposed to hold all of this together someday, I said. "That's not a criticism. It's just a different kind of caution than hers, and I understand it a lot better than you might think." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, more simply than I expected from him, "I'm glad you're here." It was not an elaborate reconciliation, and I have come to appreciate, in the months since, that it did not need to be. Some relationships rebuild themselves in small, honest sentences rather than grand ones, and I have found that I trust the small, honest kind considerably more than I once trusted the grand. I did not cut Gerald Bramwell out of my life entirely, though I want to be honest that I have kept him at a distance he has, to his credit, never once tried to argue against. We speak occasionally, briefly, mostly around holidays, conversations that carry a careful, mutual understanding that whatever exists between us now is something considerably smaller than what a father and daughter are supposed to share, and that this smallness is, at this point, simply the honest shape of things rather than a wound either of us is actively trying to reopen. He called me once, about 4 months after everything came apart, on an evening I happened to answer, without checking who was first. He didn't ask for forgiveness, which I appreciated more than I expected to. He asked, instead, whether I remembered the honor roll certificate, the one from when I was 12, and told me he'd thought about that afternoon more than almost any other memory from those years, that he'd known, even as he said, "That's what's expected," and turned back to his newspaper, that he was choosing to withhold something a child deserved simply because giving it freely felt, to a man drowning in his own resentment, like conceding something he wasn't ready to concede. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel better," he said. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know I was aware, the whole time, of exactly what I was doing to you. I don't think knowing that fixes anything. I just didn't want you carrying the version where I didn't know." I did not know what to say to that, and I still don't, entirely, except that it was, in its own limited way, more honesty than I had received from him in 27 years combined, and I have chosen to let that be worth something, even if it isn't worth everything. My mother and I are closer than we have ever been, in the strange, backwards way that a devastating truth sometimes clears more ground between two people than decades of careful silence ever did. She has met Victor exactly once, at my insistence, in a quiet cafe halfway between their two lives, a meeting I sat in on mostly out of a protective instinct I hadn't fully examined until I was actually there, watching two people who had once loved each other at 22 sit across a small table together for the first time in 27 years. It was not, in the end, dramatic. I think some part of me had braced for tears, for recrimination, for one of them finally saying the angry thing that 27 years of silence had left unsaid. Instead, Victor reached across the table, early in the conversation, and said simply, "I am so sorry for what my mother did to you. I know an apology this late doesn't undo any of it. I wanted you to hear it from me anyway." My mother, to her credit, did not let him carry the whole weight of it. "You didn't do this to me, Victor," she said. "Your mother did, and I let her because I was young and frightened and didn't know how to fight someone with that much power. We were both failed by her. I don't think either of us needs to apologize to the other for surviving it the only way we knew how." It was a brief, awkward, ultimately kind conversation in which neither of them apologized for the other's choices, only for their own, which felt, watching it happen, like exactly the right amount of accountability for two people who had both been failed, in very different ways, by the same ruthless old woman a very long time ago. They have not become friends, exactly, and I don't think either of them expected to. But my mother told me afterward in the car on the way home that she felt lighter than she had in nearly 3 decades, as though some part of her had been waiting all this time for the chance to finally say the thing out loud in front of the one other person who had actually been there for the beginning of it. "I spent so long being the only one who remembered what really happened," she said. "It's a strange kind of relief, having someone else finally carry a piece of it too." Nora, my younger half-sister on my mother's side, reached out to me a few months after everything came apart and told me, with a candor that surprised me, that she'd always sensed something unspoken sitting underneath our family, some old grief nobody would name, and that learning the truth had, in a strange way, been a relief, because it finally explained a coldness in the house she'd grown up watching her father direct at me without ever understanding why. We met for coffee that first time, both of us a little nervous in a way that felt strange given we'd known each other our entire lives, and she told me about a memory she'd carried for years without ever mentioning it to anyone, a night when she was maybe 9, overhearing Gerald and my mother arguing in low voices about the arrangement and what we agreed to, a phrase she hadn't understood at the time and had simply filed away, uneasily, as one of the many things in that house nobody explained. "I used to feel guilty," she told me, turning her coffee cup slowly on the table between us, getting things you didn't get and not knowing why, and being too scared to ask if it was fair. "I think some part of me always knew it wasn't fair. I just didn't have the words for it, and by the time I did, it felt too late to say anything. We have dinner together now, most months, just the two of us, building something quieter and more honest than anything the 4 of us ever managed to build together under one roof. Casey, older and more like Gerald in temperament, has kept his distance, polite but unmistakably cool, and I have made my peace with the possibility that some relationships simply don't survive a truth this large, no matter how much grace either side tries to bring to it. He sent me a single text message the week the story became impossible to avoid within the family, for words, "Glad you're okay," and I have chosen to take it at face value, the small, awkward gesture of someone who doesn't yet know what else there is to say and may never fully arrive at more than that. I don't hold it against him. Not everyone processes a rearranged family history at the same speed, and I have learned, slowly, that some doors are worth leaving open even when nobody walks through them right away. I work full-time at Castellan and Company now, heading the company's appraisal and authentication division, a role that exists in no small part because Victor insisted, after everything with Simon came to light, that the company needed exactly the kind of unglamorous, detail-obsessed vigilance I had spent my whole life developing without ever once being told what it was for. I have my own office now, 3 floors above the back room where I first heard the story of my own beginning, with a window that looks out over the same downtown my mother once walked to work in at 22, young and in love, and about to be quietly, deliberately erased from a family that decided her blood wasn't worth the complication it would bring. I still call Mrs. Okafor most weeks, mostly out of habit, though our conversations have shifted, Over the past year, from her teaching me to me telling her about the strange, improbable turns my life has taken since the last time we spoke. She laughed. The first time I told her the full story, a real laugh, delighted and slightly disbelieving, and then she said something I have thought about often since. I always told you that you notice what other people don't bother looking for, she said. I just never imagined the thing you'd eventually notice was your own life. She still sends me interesting consignment pieces to look at, old habits neither of us has any interest in breaking, and I still find, every time, that the quiet satisfaction of catching a small, overlooked detail feels exactly the same whether the piece is worth $200 or $2 million. Adrian and I have built something over the past year that I did not expect, given how carefully guarded he was the first night we met. He asked me, a few months after Simon's resignation, to co-lead the redesign of the company's internal audit procedures alongside him, a project that has kept us in the same conference room most weeks since, and somewhere in the process of rebuilding a system together, the wariness between us quietly gave way to something closer to an actual working friendship, the kind built on shared long nights and mutual respect rather than obligation. He still calls me, teasingly, the auditor who crashed the family, though there's no edge left in it when he says it now, only the particular fondness of someone who has come to genuinely enjoy having me around. He told me, over drinks after we finally finished presenting the new audit framework to the board, that he'd spent the first few weeks after our father found me quietly hoping I'd turn out to be exactly the kind of opportunist he'd feared, because it would have been simpler, he said, to resent someone who deserved it than to make room in his understanding of his own family for someone who genuinely didn't. You made it a lot harder to keep my guard up than I wanted you to, he said, raising his glass slightly in something between a toast and an apology. I'm not mad about it anymore. I just wanted you to know I noticed exactly when it happened. Victor gave me the Castellan star last spring, not as an heirloom exactly, since it had spent 9 years partially replaced by a fraud nobody had caught, but as something closer to a fresh start, the sapphire and diamonds reset in a design I helped choose myself, a small, private ceremony of exactly 2 people in his study, my father placing a piece of his family's history into my hands and telling me, quietly, that it had always been meant for someone with an eye sharp enough to protect it. Properly, he just hadn't known for 27 years that such a person already existed, waiting in a house 3 towns away, learning to notice everything precisely because nobody around her had ever noticed enough of her. I think, sometimes, about that jewelry box on the top shelf of my mother's closet, the one I wasn't supposed to open, the pearl earrings and the folded newspaper clipping, and the Polaroid of a young woman laughing in front of a shop window, holding on to the one small, secret piece of a life she'd been forced to leave behind. I understand now what she was keeping, and why, and I have come to think of that locked box not as evidence of a lie, but as evidence of exactly how much of the truth she managed to protect, quietly for 27 years, even while she was too frightened to speak the rest of it out loud. Sabine took me, a few months ago, to see the original Castellan storefront, the small shop, long since converted into a private event space, where our father met my mother nearly 3 decades earlier. She'd found an old employee photograph in the company archives while researching the history for an anniversary campaign, and she brought it to me almost shyly, unsure whether it would be a welcome thing to see or an unbearable one. It was my mother, 22 years old, standing at the appraisal counter in a photograph dated the same year as the Polaroid I'd found in her jewelry box as a teenager, her expression caught mid-laugh, entirely unguarded, looking like a woman with no idea yet how much she was about to lose and how long it would take to get even a small piece of it back. I asked Sabine if I could keep a copy. She told me I could keep the original, that it belonged with me more than it belonged in a company archive, and I have it now framed on the desk in my office, the closest thing I have to a photograph of my mother as a person entirely separate from everything that happened to her afterward. I do not know if I believe a broken dish on a kitchen floor was ever really an accident of nerves rather than something closer to relief. 27 years of held breath finally, involuntarily, let go. I know only that it was the sound that finally let the truth into a house that had been quietly built around keeping it out, and that everything I have now, the father I found, the sister who hugged me before I'd even said a word, the work that finally makes sense of every instinct I spent a childhood mistaking for a flaw, started with that single, ordinary sound of porcelain hitting tile. There is a version of that Tuesday evening where the doorbell never rings, where Victor Castellan decides, in the end, that 27 years is too long a silence to break, that the kindest thing he can do for a stranger who has built a life without him is to simply let her keep building it undisturbed. I understand why a version of him might have made that choice. Grief does strange things to a person's sense of what's owed and to whom, and I do not think, if he had chosen silence instead, that I would have spent my life aware of exactly what I was missing. I would have simply gone on believing, the way I always had, that the coldness in that house was a private flaw of my own rather than a decision made by other people, long before I was old enough to have any say in it at all. I am grateful, more than I know how to fully put into words, that he chose the harder, braver thing instead. I asked him once, months after that first meeting, why he'd come to the house himself instead of sending a lawyer or a letter or Roland Finch, the investigator who had actually located us. We were sitting in his study, the same room where he would later place the reset Castellan star into my hands, and he was quiet for a moment before he answered. Because I had already let one letter decide the shape of your entire life without my say in it, he said. My mother read a letter meant for me and made a decision on my behalf that cost me 27 years with my own daughter. I was not going to let another piece of paper be the thing that finally introduced us. Whatever this was going to be, I wanted you to see my face when I said it, so you'd at least know I was real, and that I meant it, and that I wasn't hiding behind anything the way she once hid behind everything. He looked at me then, in a way that still, months later, catches somewhere in my chest whenever I think about it. I had spent 27 years imagining 100 different versions of this conversation. I was not going to let the 101st version be a phone call. I visited Mrs. Okafor's shop myself, not long ago, on an afternoon I had free between meetings, mostly because I wanted to stand again in the small, cluttered space where all of this had actually begun, long before I understood what any of it was building toward. She was helping a customer when I walked in, and she caught my eye over the counter and smiled the particular smile of someone who has watched a person grow into exactly who they always suspected she'd become. "There she is," she said, once the customer had gone, coming around the counter to hug me. The girl who used to sneak extra hours just to look a little longer at things nobody else thought were worth a second glance. I told her I still did that most days, just with considerably higher stakes now. She laughed and told me that was, as far as she was concerned, the whole point of the work, that the stakes were never really the thing that mattered, only the looking closely and honestly at whatever was actually in front of you instead of what you've been told to expect. If you take one thing from the story, let it be this. The coldness you grow up absorbing as evidence of your own unworthiness is very often not about you at all. It is the residue of a decision made by someone else, long before you were old enough to understand it, and it is never, not once, too late to find out the truth was something entirely different than the silence made it feel like. I spent 27 years believing I was simply the daughter nobody had quite gotten around to loving properly. I have come to understand, slowly and on my own terms, that I was never that at all. I was the daughter two frightened people and one ruthless one decided to hide for reasons that had everything to do with money and pride and nothing whatsoever to do with what I actually deserved. I found my way out of that hiding anyway. It just took a broken dish, a stranger on a porch, and 27 years of a truth patiently waiting for someone brave enough, finally, to knock. And I have not looked back since.